Hello, everyone. So excited to be here again, especially with my wonderful guest today and good friends and colleagues on LinkedIn. We've got Catherine Chadwick, we've got Dave Snell, and we've got Charles Caldwell from Hong Kong. And today's show is going to be focused on integrity. Love to hear comments and questions that we might be able to address to stay as relevant and productive as possible. I always start with Dave so far, so it shouldn't be a surprise. Dave,
It was
nice to
hopefully a little
be back.
surprise, but that's okay. I
Always.
think I'll start with, hey, I'm glad to be back. I'm sorry I missed last week again. Couldn't be avoided, unfortunately, but I'm glad to be back with Catherine and Charles, and of course with you, Don, and the entire crowd. It's always a pleasure. It's something I look forward to every week, and I miss it when I am unavailable. Integrity is such a great word, as they always are, but as someone who has served in the military, integrity was the biggest part of our role of living with integrity, and having a moral code to go with it was very important. And when I first saw the word integrity today, I said, integrity is great, but you have to have something against which you balance it. A code of which you're going to, a moral, ethical, religious, whatever it is, a code that you're going to base that integrity on, and what it is that you're trying to achieve with your integrity, not just for integrity's sake. So many of us think honesty is part of it's a big part of it, but think it's everything and the only thing. And a couple of other thoughts I have that'll come up through the conversation, I hope, and I'll leave it there as a start.
Okay, that's a beautiful start. Catherine?
Well, it's really fascinating because I think growing up on a farm, you learn integrity quite early because Mother Nature is Mother Nature. And learning to govern yourself, right, I believe is really a huge part of self-development. And what came to mind also was the four agreements, right? And the simplicity of integrity, because it's not always simple to be in integrity. But when you think about it, it is a very simple concept. And when you do it, it's a beautiful, simple, and uncomplicated way to live.
Well put. Charles?
Yeah, hard to match those two. But it's great to be back here. And I think that hoping that the discussion today will go. I love that you've mentioned, Catherine, the four agreements. I'm hoping that we can really dive into that a lot in our discussion in the next hour.
Mhm.
Because when people first think of integrity, they think of ethics and ethical behavior, which I think is important and critical. But I think that there's an aspect of integrity that makes a person whole and complete.
Mhm.
And when you're not whole and complete, you're out of integrity. And when you are whole and complete, you are in integrity. And then what you would identify yourself as being whole and complete against would be those standards that Dave was referencing, whether that's a moral code or something else. I think that that's a way that hopefully we can really expand the conversation around integrity in the next hour.
Yeah, what a great setup for me and for the show. Yeah, I look at integrity, especially as I've gotten older, as being more about intention and about the why, not so much the what you've done. And there's something about pride of doing it the right way, the honorable way, the way that has helped people. Because most people, I think, view integrity as, are you honest or dishonest? Are you real or not real? But what's the purpose of what you do, of what you've done, and what it's meant to people? And that allows you to take pride in things that maybe not been judged as successful in other people's eyes, but again, sticking to that moral code, knowing that it was something you wanted to do and you accomplished. too many people measure things in results. How much did I make? How far did I run? All this other. But how did it, I think to Charles's point, integrate with the rest of you? Are you bringing your whole self to the table? And are there certain things you don't care to do, no matter what the result could be? And I think that takes integrity to say no to things that most people would say yes to and stay on your course. Looks like Jason's here, at least in comments. Good morning from California. A great topic. Heading out to my event. Be well, Jason. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Jason's on a rotating every other week because he's got a consulting project that he's very excited about, and so happy for him. If anybody's asking about Sarah Dawkins, she went to visit her elderly father in England, who she's assisting and supporting. So, there's always a story behind a story. So getting back to Dave, now you're the fifth comment.
Great. And I don't know that I have much to add here. I think, Catherine, your comment about Mother Nature and the way things always come back, you'll always know the truth in the end. It'll always come back to you, I think, is where you're getting at. It has a natural way of occurring. And I go back, I was thinking about this morning. I went back to a story in my head of when I was an officer of the deck on a ship and we were about to pull into Portugal. And I think I've shared this story before, maybe not. It was like 4 or 5 in the morning. We had a ship that was supposed to come within 5 miles of our closest point of approach. And by that measure, I was supposed to call the captain and say, look, Captain, we got this. I've tried to maneuver. Didn't happen. I said, you know what? I'm not going to call him. But I knew that within an hour, he was going to be up on my station on the bridge, and he was going to ask me about all the contacts, and I would have to tell him that one came within 5 miles. And sure enough, he did. And I had a point I could say, well, Captain, that one was just outside, or I could say it was just inside, or it changed course. I could have made something up. But I knew in the heart of hearts, A, the mission says I have to tell them. B, to Catherine's point, the truth will always come out. I'm not the only one. I didn't have a secret. There were other people who would have known that I lied. So I had to make the honest answer and say, boss, I knew what I was doing. I did not call you, but I knew you were coming up in a few minutes and it was going to be okay. But that was a level of trust that he had in me to drive the ship, to tell him the truth when the truth mattered, and that I could make a call that didn't interrupt him like the last 10 minutes of his sleep cycle. It wasn't critical. It wasn't like we were about to get hit in the next hour and a half, 2 hours, or ever. So integrity is a big part of what we did in the military. And I think those stories just to key in it, that was 27 years ago plus, and it still sticks with me.
Yeah, well, that's important because you get extra dividends from recalling something and then hopefully applying it to something very relative to it. Catherine?
Well, going to those 4 agreements, right? The first one is to be impeccable with your word, which is a beautiful follow-up to what you were just talking about, Dave. And to tell how it is, right? And what's fascinating is, and I know when I was a kid, I did it all the time. I didn't always tell the truth because I knew there was going to be a consequence that I didn't want, right? And oh my gosh, as I got older, the undoing of that thought process is not easy, right? And what's also interesting is that you can pick up, particularly if you've had that experience and you've been down that road for a while as a kid, you can pick up when other people are couching or not telling the whole truth, the whole story, right? And not every time do we know, but boy, it really does inform a lot of the senses, and that, in fact, has served me quite well in being able to sense that in myself. Is that coming back again? Oh, no, we're not doing that. And also, I'm not quite sure that I'm buying what you just said, right? And I think it's a fascinating thing, this whole being impeccable with your word, because when we're not in alignment, it affects every single bit of us.
Absolutely. And that's so well put. Charles?
Yeah, and I would add to that that the one area where it affects us is it comes back to what I was saying before, is it creates a hole in your integrity, particularly with yourself.
Yep.
So one of the big problems that people have is breaking their word with their self. So keeping your word with other people is one thing, but then there's also keeping your word with yourself, and that can really erode an individual's power. Both will erode an individual's power. If they break their word with other people, there's consequences, like you say, Catherine. There's always consequences. But but there are also consequences when you break your word with yourself.
Yes.
And we're not talking about going after life dreams and passions, although that's one thing. If you've always had a lifelong dream to pursue something and then you don't, there's a consequence, repercussion of that. But there's more fundamental areas around human behavior where it's critical to keep your word with yourself, and even down to managing your well-being and making commitments around fitness, well-being,
Right.
financial well-being. And when you break those commitments with yourself, you really, really erode your power with yourself, and it's hard to reestablish that. And often people need a coach or a mentor or an accountability partner if they really get into a dire situation where they've had that loss of power.
Yeah, I think we're on the same wavelength, and we're really evolving through this conversation. Naturally, all these conversations usually bring a story, like David just mentioned, uh, on the ship. I can relate to a story. My son at the time was going to University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and was one of the top coaches at Gorman High School, which is a gated community high school, which they actually recruit from all over the world, their sports players, and put together most of the golfers and baseball players that show up later on. And anyways, he had they were going to be playing a tournament in Salt Lake City. And within a day or so was my wife's birthday. And he had mentioned about driving in from Salt Lake. And I looked at the weather, and it was going to be a raging blizzard. And we switched cars in the winter because he was in Vegas. So I gave him my rear wheel drive, and I got the pickup truck. Well, make a long story short, I said, no, there's going to be a blizzard, John. It's going to be raging. If you really want to come in, take a flight from Salt Lake to Denver. I'll pick you up at the airport. And he said, no problem. And I said, do me a favor, don't drive. So anyways, I thought to myself, maybe I was a little too harsh. It took me a couple hours. And I thought, well, he's, over 18. He should be able to make his own decisions. So anyways, I called him back a few hours later. And I said, listen, I'm sorry. I shouldn't, you've got good judgment. Do what you believe. And he says, well, I got to tell you something. I said, what is it? He says, when I called you the first time, I was in Cheyenne already, which is only 90 miles from Denver. And he said, once you kind of shared what you needed or wanted me to do, and I told him how important it was, I decided to drive back to Salt Lake. And I said, oh my goodness. I said, how is it? He says, it's awful. You can't see. It's blinding snow. And he's, like I say, he's got rear wheel drive. And I said, well, do me a favor. Next hotel, motel, anything you see, pull in. It's already nighttime. And let's talk in the morning, just get yourself safe. So I said, call me at 8 the next morning. And what happened at 8:30 that morning, he showed up at our doorstep, and he said, I never had to tell you how close I was to Denver when you told me under no circumstances are you to come drive home. And he says, you would have never known if I wouldn't have mention that. I say, yeah, John, but you would have always known, you know? And I think that's the lesson for both of us. And I think what it lends itself to is how integrity impacts relationships.
Mhm.
You know, it's not just your word, but can you be trusted? You know, are you upfront, you know, about what you're doing? And that builds a bridge, you know, and it also lent itself to apologizing for when you're wrong, for being open. And again, I think integrity is about condition and relativity, you know, so some things need to be adjusted based on circumstances, but they can be communicated also. So it's not an absolute type of rule. And, you know, it just opened up more conversations versus others. And then to the person who is dishonest, there's a sense of guilt. You know, when you're telling somebody an untruth and maybe getting away with it, you feel bad because you couldn't own up to it, you know, or it wasn't a strong enough conversation. And I think a lot of people don't start conversations properly or don't share information properly. They try to taint it a little bit, maybe in their favor, maybe not. But I think it's also about sharing what's involved. You know, integrity is not a yes or a no. You know, it's really a combination of thoughts and actions. And over time, where is it going to lead you? Because once you start going down that dishonest path,
Mhm.
it makes it easier and easier to continue down that path. But I recognize that as you get older, you don't need as much of memory as long as you're staying honest. You know, when you got to start to think, what did I tell that person last time? And you forget, and all of a sudden they know because people keep things in their mind. So that doesn't square with what you were saying before or whatever. So, anyways, I know I got off onto a little bit of a longer comment, and for that reason, we got Charles had a comment also. Traditional views of integrity associate integrity with ethics or virtue, but integrity is much more than that. It sure is. And you know, there's one thing about laying your head down on your pillow at night and feeling good about yourself for what you did, what you said, how you interacted. And most things that people lie about are very insignificant, you know, and some people just lie about everything and they don't even know they're lying after a while,
Right.
you know, so you lose even contact with your moral compass. Dave?
Yeah, I think it becomes very easy to continue the lies when you just don't even realize after a while. I think you're absolutely right, Don. I like the two things I'll bring up. First, your story reminded me of, you know, I have a couple of adopted moms, and one of them is a very, I have to confess my sins to every so often, and I have to be honest with her every time. I've never lied to her. I've thought I was going to keep something from her, and I just never can. The funny story was I'd gotten to my only tattoo was a Navy tattoo that I got with a bunch of shipmates. It was a very small one on my lower ankle, and my stepmom saw it with my dad at a trip down here to Florida one time back. This was back in 1998, and I was like, okay, great, they saw it, no problems. And then my stepmother said, well, you do know we're meeting up with Mom Mady next week, right? And I was like, oh God, I've got to confess, because if they tell her, it's one thing. If I tell Mom, it's another. So I had to confess, and I promised my mother I would never get another. So anyway, that's where I stand with being honest right from the start and making sure that you're never trying to hide something from someone who matters to you. That's my story there. But I go back to Catherine, your comment. You said the comment was, when we're not in alignment, it affects us. And integrity, I see so many people in society, I think, that are not in alignment. They're not even being true to themselves with where they stand on political, social, economic issues. And that drives a lot of the angst I think we're seeing in our nation today. Not to draw in a political conversation, but I think because we've lost our moral compass as a society, maybe, or religious code, whatever it is, we're seeing a lot of that angst. And I'm not one who likes to watch TV a lot with the news, But in the last week and a half, I've kind of turned it back on just to catch up on a few things going on in the Middle East in particular, because I've gotten friends requesting me for input on it. And it just bothers me the more I see that people are just not being honest with themselves. And I wonder if that's not being drawn back to a lack of alignment with a moral code of some sort that is driving them that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to that point. And truth is hard to identify, especially with AI these days and everything else. Catherine?
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating is, to your point, Charles, how being, not keeping your word to yourself. The first thing that came to my mind was it comes out in fears, in procrastination, in all sorts of behaviors that do not serve us well. And that contributes to the lack of alignment, right? So we have a lot of opportunities to be out of alignment if we allow those things to come in, right? And what's fascinating is how this is coming around in the conversation, because the second agreement is don't take anything personally. And that's not necessarily easy to do, is it? Because there are so many things coming at us all of the time, in addition to what we're thinking, what we're feeling. And I think that people just do what they know. And many people don't evaluate what they know or what they think they know or how they choose to move forward or how they act. And I think sometimes when we do take something personally, it may have been intended that way, it may not have been intended that way. And I think what goes along with that, a good question to ask, is it true? Do they even understand or realize what they're saying or what they're doing? Right. And so I think it's important, to getting back to the alignment piece, to have that plumb line be very steady.
Yeah, that's important. Very important. Charles?
Yeah, another aspect of integrity, I got a couple of points here, which I think is intertwined into what everyone has shared so far, is that so earlier I talked about how integrity is about us being our word with ourselves. It's also about being your word with another person, but it's also about being in alignment and in agreement with another person. So for example, so I would call that workability.
Right.
So for example, you're married maybe, and your spouse always leaves the bathroom floor wet after a shower, and that might drive you mad because you walk in and you get your socks wet and that kind of thing. And one person may not care if the bathroom floor is wet after a shower, and the other person, it matters a lot. So then you have a conversation about workability, and you say, look, it doesn't work for me to not hang up the towels, or it doesn't work for me to have the bathroom floor wet. I request that we align on this. And a person can then say, yeah, sure, I can align on that. I'll make sure the bathroom floor is dry, or I'll hang up my towels. And that is the very simplified version excuse me, of workability. And I think one of the things that's happened to what Dave's identified in his what we're seeing in society today, and it's global, it's happening in a lot of places, is this lack of workability, and people are taking things personally.
Yep.
In fact, people are becoming so individualistic and so polarized in their thinking that people do take things personally, and then they what starts to happen is that ability to work things out starts to erode. And then we don't have a loss of power with the individual who's broken their word with himself. We have a loss of power with people, and in a loss of power within community, and the inability to collaborate. And so I wanted to just got to speak to that a little bit. Excuse me. The other thing is about breaking your word with yourself. You can really get into a vicious cycle. We talked about, the white lies and little lies. You were saying, Don, a lot of the lies that people make are insignificant lies. And so, why would they just be straight and tell the truth? And a really insignificant lie, I remember I was in a personal development program years ago, and the leader said, one of the ways that people end up being habitually late for their life is they're late once as a young person, whether that's as a child or a teenager or a young adult. They're late once, they lie about it, and then they're out of alignment with their own word, and they're late for the rest of their life until they really do some deep work and start to clean it up.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, from what everybody's saying and what I'm hearing, integrity has so much to do with respect for yourself, and more importantly, respect for the person you're with. And the question is, why couldn't you tell the truth? Usually is, well, I didn't trust that person to appreciate it. Or I knew how they would react and I did them a favor by providing something to them that was more comfortable. And that's just a double lie to yourself, right? You're justifying something that you know is wrong because someone can't appreciate it, someone won't understand it, or justifying you lied to me, so it's okay if I lied to you. And you go down that path. And the question is why? Why can't someone take responsibility? Why can't someone be accountable? And why can't someone come back around and say, I think back of what I was saying and I missed something, because I always appreciate when people came clean first. I always knew in business if I had something that was going to happen and be known anyways, why not be the first one to get in front of it? Right? I mean, when I had to pay vendors and I didn't have the cash at the time, they always appreciated when I said, listen, I just want to get in front of this. Next week's payment, it's going to be difficult to make. Can you allow me another week? And all the time would be sure. Why? Because you're working with me, you're sharing something. And what I also learned, no one likes surprises. It's like, when did you know? And why didn't I know when you knew? And a lot of times you think maybe I can square it before it even happens. I can fix it. I just need more time. And again, it's like, well, obviously you don't trust me or respect me. Whether people say that or not is not as important as you knowing it. I think it was Shakespeare that said, as the day follows the night, no man can, something about if you're not true to yourself, you can't be true to anybody else. And I am true to that. I mean, even all those shows I did, I never missed a show. I never missed being on time on 700 shows. And, it was something I felt why, and I get challenged by people who aren't punctual because I see what people do before they go somewhere to be late to that something, right? They could have left 20 minutes earlier, but they're playing games on their phone or they're doing something else. And it's like, why didn't you just get there early? It's almost like if I get there 5 minutes in advance, I'm giving too much up, as opposed to, won't it be more comfortable driving? Won't it be more comfortable being there on time? And what does that mean? Well, we've got a lot of comments. Integrity is choosing your thoughts and actions, Dave, based on values rather than personal gains. And your values will exceed your personal gains on your small minded activities that you might lend your dishonesty to.
Mhm.
The values will keep you on the right track. And who do we have? We've got Dean LeBay. If you don't know Dean, you should know Dean. He was here from the beginning. He has an incredible life story of being told he'd never ever walk again, be confined to a bed. And since then, he's learned to walk. And I just saw you, Dean, at the Restaurant Association show again. So good for you. And the potato is his trademark, and that has a story to it. He grew up in a very small town in Texas that only industry was an ammunitions depot for the Army. So I know all about it. So thanks for coming, Dean. Always in my mind. Appreciate you so much. Charles says lack of integrity doesn't necessarily make you bad, but it undermines your power, your ability to produce results, build trust, and operate effectively in the world. Well put. Next one, when you're out of integrity, broken promises, unfulfilled commitment, you lose credibility, not just with others, but with yourself. And this leads to distrust, diminished confidence, a sense of being at effect rather than cause in life. And last one for now, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night, the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. So it's always good to have Charles here to throw everything out and he'll make it right. Appreciate that so much. And one last thing I'd like to throw in, the beauty of birthdays and Father's Days especially is when you get cards from your kids. And like this year's cards were so beautiful from both my son and daughter about how I was their inspiration and how I was their guidepost and how I lived my life. And I had the wonderful honor of having all of my kids work with me for 8 years in the business, every day, side by side. And I was able to share and teach them so much as a peer instead of as a parent, especially knowing I could never even have them make their bed, let alone do something really important at work. And it changed everything around. So it validates and confirms things that happen later. And how many people come up to you and say, hey, Dave or Catherine or Charles, because of what you said to me that time, or because of what you did, it changed my life or changed my direction or made me feel something. And that's the dividends you get beyond the short-term results that you may have. I forgot where I left off. Dave, okay, great.
I'm just going to pick up a little bit on, it's a little off topic, on your being late for things and people having other things on their mind. I think that we've just gotten to the point in society that we've been so attached to our phones that we lose track of time. Whereas there's also a theory in my mind that when I was in the military, it was 15 minutes early or you're late everywhere you went. But then I retired and I went into the corporate world, or I transitioned. Sorry, I didn't fully retire, but I went into the corporate world and I was told, oh no, if you're 15 minutes early, that means you don't have enough work to do and we need to get you some more work. And that was a very big culture shock for me, but it was still I'll say an integral part of my culture and my personality that I had to be early. I didn't want to be late by any measure. And maybe I let it slip to 5 minutes before, but that's, still early. But integrity, try to bring it back to integrity. I've just had such a strong attachment to the moral code that it was ingrained in me for 20 years plus, 24 years with my training beforehand. I just don't know that I see it as integral to our culture anymore. And I'll go back to that again and again, that I'm seeing a loss of that in a lot of, and I think to Charles's point, globally as well.
Yeah, and everybody is, and it's only accelerating with the speed of the internet and with artificial intelligence. Catherine?
Well, it's funny. When I was taking karate for all those years, if you were not in the door, changed into your gi, and on the floor on time, don't bother coming at all, right? So it sounds a little bit like the military, I suspect, right?
Yep.
And it's also important in healthcare and obviously many arenas. What's fascinating is the third agreement is don't make assumptions. And we likely can make assumptions all day long, right? And there are things that we can not necessarily make an assumption about, though we do have some history with it, so we can make more of an educated guess, right? Or we can kind of count on some of that information. However, things are changing all of the time, and new information comes around all of the time. So I think it's imperative to ask questions, to evaluate, is this still true? Does this still hold true? I know working in healthcare, if you're making assumptions, you're doing not only yourself a disservice, you're doing your patients, your clients a disservice, because making an assumption about how they're feeling, or there have been no changes since the last time you saw them, or since yesterday, or since the last hour, basically, mistakes happen that way. And it's coming down to respect, as you say, Don. And it's also about not just respect for them, it's respect for the process. The alignment of the process. There are certain universal laws and energy principles that play into everything, and it's important to evaluate those as well, I believe.
Absolutely. Great point. Charles?
Well, we've talked a lot about falling out of integrity and being out of integrity and the risks around that and our observations around that. I think another thing that's worth talking about is how do you get back into integrity?
Mm-hmm.
And I think on an individual basis, the most important thing is to recognize that there's been some sort of breach, that you've fallen out of integrity and you need to go and you need to clean it up.
Mm-hmm.
So coming back to the simple, ridiculous shower example, you forget to clean up the shower floor or the bathroom floor, and you realize later on your way to work you did that. So, you make a quick phone call to your spouse and say, sorry about that. I made a mistake, and you've cleaned it up. So there's a really simple thing. You identify that you haven't kept your word, or somehow in relation to your commitments or promises or expectations, explicit or implicit, something's fallen out. And so you work to clean it up. And the other important thing about getting back into integrity is taking full responsibility for it. So no excuses, no justifications, and coming around to the discussion we've had about being late and making up lies about it, and how the world these days has become very, very, very casual. And there's a lot of examples of how you've seen it become more casual. You just look at Exhibit A would be the dress code has become business casual now, or even super business casual. But the key thing is to take full responsibility. Don't try to justify, for example, why you've been late, but really own, okay, I was late. I didn't leave enough time to get here. It's up to me, and you take full responsibility for that, as opposed to trying to justify it. You really own that you said X and you did Y, and as a result, you were late. And this is about ownership. It's not about blame. And then you communicate and acknowledge cleaning up, things like that. Apologize if you need to. Sometimes you just need to acknowledge it, and people get it because they understand things are not personal. And other times people might have taken things personally, and they need to hear and apologize for them to move forward. And then you clean up the impact. So if something's not right, there's something that needs to be done to clean it up and restore it and repair things. Then you do that and recommit to your original integrity, whether explicit or implicit, going forward.
Yeah, those are wonderful points. It reminds me of a personal situation. Small thing, but an important thing is I happen to be on the east side of town. I live on the west side of town, so about 20 miles away. And it was a warm day, and I went to an ice cream parlor and got an ice cream cone and paid for it. And it was a wonderful young lady, probably her first job that she had, who was behind the counter. And anyways, enjoyed the ice cream, drove home, and I discovered she had given me $20 change for a $10 bill. And I thought to myself, because I've been in retail and everything else, I drove all the way back there and gave her that extra money because I know the drawer would be short that night,
Yeah.
right? And she'd be responsible, and maybe she didn't even know how she lost the $10 extra.
Mm.
But it was worth it to me, and I didn't have to. It was her mistake, even though I wasn't counting the money when I left there. Then I went over there, explained everything to her. She was so happy. She almost had tears in her eyes. And I thought to myself, everything has a second side, another side. The other point is, if you ever saw Scent of a Woman, and Al Pacino yells at the schoolmaster, "You can't handle the truth. You don't want the truth. You can't handle it." Is sometimes he's right, but it also says, who are you associating with that you can't be honest with because they don't appreciate it, they won't understand it? What organizations are you working for that lack integrity and continue to duplicate that through the ranks? And at a certain point, do you leave when you know it's not aligned or the right place for you?
Mhm.
And I think when you approach more of a minimalistic approach where you're not doing things for things, but you're doing things for purpose or intent, you can say, I can afford to take a smaller job with less money, as opposed to continue to, you know, mitigate my own virtues and become more of what they are, because you tend to follow the crowd, right? And you find some validation. Well, everybody's doing it, and that's the way you get ahead. I mean, especially if you're in sales. I mean, that's where integrity really gets tested. Are you really giving me the full story? Are you hyping up something saying the sale ends tomorrow when it just continues forever? And those things are short-term transactional situations, but do you want to live a life of short-term transactional relationships?
Mhm.
Or do you want to build on rock and be someone people admire? Most of the people I admire are not the most successful people or the richest people I know, but they're steady as can go. They're dependable, they're reliable. And where are your fair weather friends when it starts turning not so fair weather? And that's where integrity comes in. When people help you when they really had no reason to, they weren't the people you thought would, but you didn't know them that well. And they didn't know you that well sometimes on the other way. So, I think it's just a matter of feeling good about yourself. And that's usually the litmus test at the end of the day. Did I treat people really well? Do people feel better for the time I spent with them? What did I contribute? I mean, even in my long marriage, everything I do, I say, is this going to make Anne feel better or healthier? Is this going to extend her life? Whatever I do, And usually, what you give is what you get. Sometimes you got to be the first to give. Sometimes you got to be the only one to give for a while. But even out of self-reward, people will start to fall in and say, why not do what they're doing for me to them to show appreciation, but also to keep it going. So I think that's so valuable. I'll start with Dave again, guessing that we're going around the circuit again.
Yeah, a little bit. And I think that's a great story that you shared about going back to return the money. And it speaks something greater than integrity is to your character, that is Don Cohen. Integrity is a big part of our character and who we are. But both, I'll go back to the very beginning, both rely on the moral and ethical code that we've talked about or I've mentioned several times, and I think we've all mentioned. And so many people have not done the inner workings of self-reflection of what it is that makes them tick, what it is that's making them happy, what it is that's going to make somebody else happy, and going through those machinations that will make them realize that what they're doing is going to make them happy better than feel worse, or make somebody else feel better than feel worse.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's something that a lot of people aren't sensitive to. They don't have an awareness of that equation, let's say. Catherine?
Oh, when you were talking, Don, it reminded me of in New York when I first started going in and out of the city. There were two locations, and the sign, big sign in the window, 90% reduction, store closing sale. Well, that was up for about 3 years. So it's like, okay, how telling is that? And that led me to thinking about a little research project I've been doing about incivility. particularly in the workforce, but in hospital healthcare, right? Because healthcare ranks as a very high environment for incivility. And why is it tolerated? And that makes it very difficult to work when people are refusing to do part of what they were hired to do. It's a blatant disrespect for coworkers and obviously for themselves. If you think it's okay to show up for work and you don't really work, I mean, and and you're taking the paycheck for it. Like, what's with that? And I think that it leads to a second part of the research project that has led me to. And I'd have to go back and verify whether it was a Gallup poll or an HR poll that globally, 1 in 8 people are experiencing some sort of mental illness or condition. And in the US, it's 1 in 5. And I'm like, wow, okay, we have an awful lot going on here. And when you come around to the fourth agreement of always doing your best, if you're going to work with an attitude of incivility, that's not doing your best, right? And you're definitely out of integrity. And the people that stay and continue to work with those people end up asking themselves, this is causing me to be out of integrity. And it gets to be this domino effect. And I believe that a lot of that attitude is contributing to what the polls are showing in regard to mental instability. And so I don't have all the answers. And I don't know that we all do, but oh my gosh, it's certainly things to consider. And really brings back to me, how do I want to be? Right? And because how I am affects everyone I'm in touch with, it affects the whole universal energy that we're all a part of.
Absolutely. And there's so much validity to what you're saying and importance. Charles?
I'm going to come back to well-being in a minute because I have a lot to add to that, Catherine. But your story, Dawn, of going back to the ice cream parlor reminded me of a situation when I was running a very small business in Canada, in Toronto, at the beginning of my career. And, there was always cash is king in small businesses. And there was always a rush to run around and pick up checks and drop off invoices, either by mail or usually mail things and then pick them up in order to make payroll and make accounts payable and things like that. And I remember one particular time, it was late on a Friday afternoon and I needed to get to the bank to deposit a check. And I had arranged for to pick up a check from a customer. And it was a fairly sizable check. And the customer's secretary called me and said the CFO is going to write the check because it was basically he had, I don't know, the ability to write checks for the customer. And maybe the firm was paying for it. I can't remember. Anyway, I went to pick up the check. It was waiting for me at the front reception. I go running back to my car. I get in the car. I open up the envelope, and the check was significantly larger than it was supposed to be. And I thought to myself, oh boy, if I go back in, I'm going to be late for the bank. And if I rush down to the bank and deposit this, it's the wrong amount. So I ended up going back in and asked to speak to the CFO, which was a really big deal because I'd only met the person in passing. And this wasn't a huge company. It was sort of an SME type organization. And anyway, the one thing led to another. The CFO came out, saw me, and said, well, this is okay. I know you're doing a lot of business with the customer, so just go ahead and deposit it and make sure you give us a credit on the next invoice. But the way the conversation came about, I was recounting it to some of my kind of key managers in my company at the time, and they looked at me and they said, that guy never makes mistakes. He did that on purpose to test you. For sure, they were convinced he did it to test me. So I'm glad in that case I passed the test. But the other thing is that when you fall out of integrity, habitually fall out of integrity, your environment then relates to you as the way that you operate.
Mhm.
and they call you to be out of integrity. And this is really another aspect of the importance of being your word with yourself and being your word with others. And we're not talking about fanaticism and perfection. We're talking about workability
Right.
and meeting those agreements, type of thing, in a way that really works. Because if you are someone that's habitually late, people will just relate to you as, well, that person's habitually late. They're just going to be late. Of course, they're always late, and that's problematic. The statistics on well-being are just crazy.
Mhm.
And I was on another call earlier today. There was another survey. The person didn't mention the source, but they were saying that 42% of the current global workforce were experiencing some level of mental well-being issue, whether that was severe depression or stress overload. A couple of years ago, there was a well-being study done in Hong Kong, said that 8 out of 10 people in the workforce in Hong Kong were experiencing burnout. And that same study done by the same organization in the US said it was 9 out of 10 in the US. And I think this was back in around 2023. So there's a lot of work to be done around well-being. But again, I think that some of this comes around to organizations having to take responsibility for staff well-being. The world is getting faster and faster and faster. There's all these expectations around AI now, which is just making things speed up tremendously. And I think organizations really need to take a stand for employee well-being and support staff to be well, because otherwise people are just going to check out. It amazed me in my previous role, the number of individuals who came in and interviewed with me and said, you know what, I would say to them, what's important to you in a company that you work for? And they would say to me, work-life balance. The number one thing right now is work-life balance. I want a job that's not going to stress me out. And for them, that's their integrity. They've defined it. What I need I need well-being, workability in my life.
Yeah, and I think if you have a common interest in helping people because you like to help people and you want to see how people get helped, that's a great uh, motivation to instill that in your organization. I had no one ever leave me. I had people 30 years with me, 25 years, 35 years. I saw them grow up from high school kids to almost grandparents staying in the same job because I always put them first and I always told them put the customer first. We get paid by the customer and what we do. But more importantly, I like to see happy people. I come to work every day. I'd rather see people happy and honest and sincere and being, come to me and say, I need something before I have to know about it. One last story, and always relates to my kids and my family, is my kids were pretty mediocre students. I've given they were a B students, I was giving them a little more credit. So, I come up with these ideas, and I think my son was about 13 at the time, my daughter was 15. And I said, what would it take to get you to get all A's? Just one semester. And my son at that time said, I want one of them giant TVs in my room. And those were before the flat screen. Those were the things with the big base and would take up half the room. And I said, okay, if you get all A's, I'll get you that flat screen. And my daughter says, I want a laptop. And that was when they were expensive, almost as expensive as the flat screens. I didn't think about it. And I got a call from my son and says, hey, after dinner, can you head over to Circuit City with me? And I said, sure. I didn't know, maybe needed a part or a video game or something. Then I got a call from Ann that says, listen, I know what's happening here. I want to tell you in advance, he's not getting no TV. That's just, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, he's going to get the TV if he earned it, because I'm never going to have that weighing over me that I offered something, didn't come through. And she wasn't too happy about it. And anyways, I got home and I said, I'm so proud of you and honored. You got 4 A's. It shows you're capable. And I so appreciate it. And I know we made the deal for the TV, and we're going to go get the TV tonight. Right? Because I know the first thing he's going to think is it's too expensive. It was a joke. You have 100 ways to get out of it. And then I said, well, how'd Susie do? and she got 3 A's and a B, and she's in her room totally upset and crying.
Mm-hmm.
And I could hear her wailing as I'm talking to my son in his bedroom. And they weren't always the best of friends, or, they since then have really grown close. And I said, well, you hear what's going on over there? Yeah, Susie's upset. She got 3 A's and a B. But the deal was 4 A's. I got the 4 A's. I wish she would have got the 4 A's, but I didn't have anything to do with that. I said, okay, well, let me just share something with you. This TV is going to be $4,000, and it's going to take up half of your room, and I'm going to get it for you anyways. But I can give you the $4,000 and you can do anything you want with it. Buy the TV, buy less of the TV, keep the money, whatever you want. You won, you get the prize. I said, are you going to do anything for your sister? And he said, no, she wouldn't do anything for me, would she? He said, no, you're right. She wouldn't do it. So I said, well, think about it. We'll leave in a half an hour. I'll come back and we'll go. Anyways, he said to me, he says, Dad, he says, I appreciate the offer. And I decided I don't really need that TV as bad, but I appreciate that you were willing to go out and get it. And he said, but I would like the money. And I want to do something for you and Mom with the money. I want to buy something you need. I want to give Susie something with the money. And he said, then later, he just said, listen, all I need is a little bit of clothes, and I'll take care of you and Mom and Susie. And I said, John, I said, this meant more to me than your A's, right? And I said, now you're going to get something even more special. And he said, what's this going to be? I said, in Monopoly, you get a get out of jail card. I'm going to give you a get out of jail card now for the rest of your life. If anything comes up, your car breaks down, something happens, you're in a pinch, that use this card. And everybody was happy. Ann was happy. Susie got her little stipend. He'd only got some clothes. And then about a week later, he says, I got what I want. And I said, what is it? I said, I want you and Mom to take me and Michael to Las Vegas and spend a few days there. And they were into arcades at 13 and getting these big stuffed animals. I said, certainly. And we went there, and forever, it just demonstrates how my response could have been, maybe should have been, but what would have been lost. Trust, my word. Someone works so hard to get something in anticipation of receiving something and then finds out they're not getting it because who would ever give you a $4,000 TV? And what do you need a $4,000 TV and all this other stuff? But by coming clean and owning up to it meant all the difference to me, and everybody in the family learned from it. And I think it's the education you get from experiences more than the experience, because what do I build from this? How do I go forward with this? And people look at you and say he's a man of his word, whether it was something that's comfortable at the end, or you commit to something way beyond your means. You find a way, and maybe next time you don't offer $4,000 TVs flippantly like that, because you don't assume your kids are that committed or smart enough to come through with it. And that way you're offering something that really isn't an offer. It's a dream that may not come true. Let me cover a couple of Charles' comments. Real integrity is doing the right thing, knowing that nobody's going to know whether you did it or not. This quote from National Honesty Day 2024 emphasizes that true integrity is driven by an internal moral compass, not external validation. So true. Integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. Brene Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a gentleman from Bangladesh. Good morning from Milan. Thank you for joining. Great to have an international audience. With just a few seconds left, I'll go around the horn. Dave, any last thoughts?
Just a couple here real quick. First, I wish you were my dad. Second, at the end of the day, I mean, to Charles's comment there, integrity is just doing the right thing when nobody's watching.
Yeah.
And it's more than just a value on a wall. It's something that I think more companies, more individuals need to take a hard, honest look and a value assessment of themselves from which to apply integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something you can always carry as a badge of honor, is how you stood up for yourself and for your word, whatever happened after that. And it tells you, who are you with if you can't be honest with them? And what kind of relationship will you ever have if it's based on deception and lies? Catherine?
I think it just comes back to the alignment that we were talking about before. I think that's the most important thing for any of us, because alignment encompasses so many things, right? And I think it allows us kind of a simple guide. And I think that when we don't overcomplicate things and we keep things simple, it's so much easier to be in that integrity.
Absolutely. Great thoughts. Charles?
Yeah, I think what I'd want to add to this is that everyone makes mistakes.
Mhm.
And it's important that we all work together to support one another, to resolve our mistakes and to achieve that workability that we've talked about as one of the many aspects of integrity. And the important thing I would just add to that is that a person with integrity will own up to their mistakes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I've got so many more stories, but so little time, so we'll have to save them. Because everybody is put in situations they didn't always anticipate. A lot of times you're dealing with strangers that you don't even know. It's easier to deal with somebody that is more predictable than just somebody. But I think it's also about never trying to get yourself into those situations you need to get out of,
Right.
right? When you don't overcommit, and under promise and over deliver, and be the better person. Don't keep score. I gave 52%, you only gave 48%. Meanwhile, the game's playing while you're watching the scoreboard instead of the opposite.
Mm.
And also being a kinder person. How many people said, I was expecting you to be miserable, and I was expecting you to, really bite my head off after I told you this, but you acted with some sincerity and kindness. Again, it's because this is an opportunity. Just because you're entitled to it or deserve to do something doesn't mean you should. Sometimes you pass on the punishment side. Sometimes it's easier to be compassionate and say, I know how you feel. I felt the same way until I found this out. Or, if I was in that situation, I might be doing the same thing. So showing a little understanding, which will make you more trustworthy, which means you'll hear about things as they happen or before they happen, as opposed to finding them out later where you don't really have anything you can do about it. And I think that's what you want to elicit from people, is this is a safe place. I'm a safe person. You can tell me most everything. Doesn't mean I'm going to like it, but I'll respect you for saying that. Let me see. We got a little bit of private chat. We'll have to do Integrity 2.0, Charles says, for sure. And, it's only because of this group, and groups like it, that you can share stories that you have forgotten, but have value to you, and in turn will have value to other people, hear other people's stories. And I think that's part of being mentally more stable, is having support groups, having people around you who believe in what you believe in and believe in you. And, deception doesn't ever have to even play a role. It's not necessary, unless you're just looking to build yourself up, which is not a positive thing either. So anyways, it's a great conversation when it can't end naturally on time. And that's because of value, not because of trying to hog the screen. So with that said, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for everyone who will join later on from watching on YouTube and LinkedIn. And come back next week, and Jason will be back, and we'll do it all over again. Take care. Bye.